And this is taken from a book and a film called Beethoven's Hair. And if you ever get a chance, go ahead and rent it. It's fascinating, the twists and turns that little lock of hair took in order to get where it was finally studied. And to talk about the results of that study, we have a special guest. She's a I have to be careful. She's a criminalist, not a criminologist. She's a criminalist, and she's from the city of San Diego. Will you please welcome Jennifer Shen. Welcome.
Thank you.
Jennifer, before we get started, can you tell us a little bit what a criminalist is?
Yes, I can. A criminalist is a scientist who takes evidence from crime scenes and examines it using scientific techniques to provide information to investigators who are investigating a crime. And then that scientist is responsible for presenting that evidence in a written format and, of course, in a court of law to a jury.
So you've probably been involved with some important cases over time.
I have been. I have been in forensics for many, many, many years.
Yes. Now, let's talk about Herr Beethoven and or Beethoven's hair, if you look at it. Forgive me. So, can you tell us a little bit about what tests were done on his hair and that whole wonderful story and the results?
Yes, I can. It's very interesting to me that the hair from Beethoven's head, the hair represents what was in someone's body. So if you actually think about your hair and take a handful of it and pull, it hurts. It's because it's attached to your head. It's growing, and that growth is fed by your bloodstream. And so anything that you put into your body is going to flow through your blood, and it's going to be deposited in your hair. So your hair is actually a snapshot of what you've been doing for whatever time that hair's been growing on your head. So one of the things that I found very interesting about researching this is that the forensic scientific techniques that we use today are the very same scientific techniques that we could apply to Beethoven's hair to come up with some information about him, his life, and how he might have died.
So you did the same kind of testing you would do on a criminal case? You tested the hair. How was the hair tested?
Well, one of the first things we did, and I am a microscopist, so I thought this was very interesting. One of the first things that was done is this hair was looked at using a microscope. And this was very important because we wanted to ascertain that the hair was in good condition. And that is what in fact happened. This hair was examined microscopically, and it was actually very well preserved. And the keratin, or the outer layer of the hair, was in great shape. So what that immediately told our scientists is that anything they might find inside the hair actually came from Beethoven's body versus some exterior contamination. And in forensic science, we do not like contamination. So it was important to us to show that the hair was in great condition. After we did some microscopy on the hair to show that it looked really good, the second thing that was done was a presumptive drug test. These are tests that we use every day on people now when we research crimes. So what was done is that his hair was looked at to see if there was any drugs in his system at the time that he died. And what was looked for particularly were painkillers, opiates, morphine. Because Beethoven was in such pain, it certainly was considered likely that he was taking some sort of painkiller to give him some relief. So I thought it was very interesting that, in fact, no drugs were found in his hair. So that led the investigators to believe that in order to keep his mind clear and sharp and to be able to create with all of his ability, he suffered that pain, and he lived through that pain and didn't take anything to help alleviate it.
So what did ail him?
Well, the third test that was done was another microscopy type test, and we used a scanning electron microscope. And this is an amazing instrument. It actually can magnify things up to 100,000 times. And how it does this is, instead of using light, like you would see in a typical microscope, you actually use electrons. And these electrons are focused into a beam, and they are focused into or through whatever it is you're looking at. In this case would be the hair. So this was done on Beethoven's hair. And what was done, they were looking specifically for what elements might be in his hair. And they looked for a panel of elements, mercury, lead, all of the typical type of metallic elements you would think of. And they compared what was in Beethoven's hair to what would be in a hair of a person who had just had normal exposure to the environment. So when they did that, they found out a couple of things that were very interesting. First of all, they found there was no mercury in his head, no elevated levels of mercury in his hair. And that was interesting because mercury was used as a cure or to assist someone who was suffering from syphilis. So that was one of the things people thought maybe he was suffering from syphilis. It does not appear that he was because there were not these, I'm sure, not these elevated levels of mercury. But what they did find is that in his hair there were 50, 60, 100 times more lead than in a normal person's hair. So the lead concentration in his hair was very, very high. And what that showed is that he clearly had some real exposure to lead and probably died of lead poisoning. And if you look at his symptoms, you know, the cramping and the inability to digest the food and the severe abdominal pains, all the things that he was suffering from for a good portion of his adult life, and particularly at the end of his life, were very consistent with lead poisoning.
And as you said before, it's very easy during that time to get lead poisoning. It was everywhere. It was used medicinally. It was used in the ink of the pen, et cetera, et cetera. There's another fascinating thing that was done, and it involves burning the hair and analyzing that and looking at the compounds.
Well, there were a couple types of tests that were done when we were looking for those elements. And the first test was done by Walter McCrone. And Walter McCrone, at the time he did this test, was one of the world's leading chemical microscopists. He has since passed away, and I've had actually the distinct pleasure of meeting him. He did work on the Shroud of Turin, if you will remember that. He also did work on Napoleon Bonaparte's hair, because it was surmised, I suppose, that Napoleon died of arsenic poisoning. Well, Walter McCrone did that analysis on his hair and showed that he in fact did not. So he did the work on Beethoven's hair, and what he did in his analysis was to take the hair and burn it into ashes. And then they used the electron microscope to focus the electron beam through those ashes to decipher what chemicals or what elements were in those ashes.
And there's something they called a genius trait.
That was also interesting. I learned so many things. One of the things that they wanted to do is to look for what's called a genius pattern. There's been quite a bit of work done on looking at elements in people's bodies and determining, certain elements equal high intelligence. Or they found that highly intelligent people have elevated levels of potassium and sodium. And they found that highly intelligent genius people have elevated copper and zinc levels. So this is a pattern that they were looking for. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting to find out that Beethoven did not have the genius pattern.
Isn't that interesting? And in many ways very comforting. Because it really kind of proves the point. I think one of the draws of Beethoven to humanity in general is that Beethoven was just a man who had a vision and ideals and wanted to strive for the best, but he was not extraordinarily gifted. He just worked very hard and had that kind of vision. Yeah,
I think that's one of the things that's so amazing about him. And one of the things that I had researched and seen, which I thought sort of matched into that very nicely, is one of the things that people think might have helped contribute to his lead poisoning was the fact that he in fact made lots of mistakes with his pencil full of lead. And so he would lick his fingers and wipe out the notes and lick his fingers and wipe out the notes, and that could be one of the ways he was getting small doses of lead into his system. So were he brilliant and made no mistakes, yes, perhaps he wouldn't have suffered quite so much.
Yes. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Jennifer, we really appreciate this insight, and we've learned a lot from your presence here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.